The wing part suspected of belonging to that missing Malaysian Airlines jet is now in a lab for analysis.
On March 8, 2014, 239 people boarded a routine overnight flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. Less than 40 minutes later, that flight was gone, not crashed, not diverted, just erased from every screen tracking it. No mayday, no wreckage, no answers. For over a decade, one of the richest, most technologically advanced search efforts in human history has failed to find so much as a scrap of the fuselage. But a retired British engineer named Richard Godfrey says he's done what governments, navies, and satellite companies could not. He says he traced the plane using a network of amateur radio hobbyists most people have never heard of. And in the last 2 years, his claim has gone from a fringe theory to something Malaysia's own government has spent tens of millions of dollars chasing. So what exactly did he find? Does it hold up? And where does the hunt for MH370 actually stand right now? Let's get into it. To understand why Godfrey's theory matters, you have to go back to the night everything went wrong. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was a Boeing 777, one of the safest aircraft ever built. Carrying mostly Chinese and Malaysian passengers on a flight Malaysia Airlines had made thousands of times before. It left Kuala Lumpur just after midnight. Cruising altitude, clear skies, nothing unusual. Around the 38-minute mark, as the aircraft approached the handoff point between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace, the crew signed off with air traffic control. It was an ordinary exchange, nothing that hinted at what was about to happen. Within 2 minutes, the plane's transponder, the system that broadcasts a jet's identity, altitude, and speed to civilian radar, went silent. To air traffic controllers watching their screens, the aircraft simply vanished. It hadn't, though. Malaysia's military radar, which doesn't rely on the aircraft cooperating the way civilian radar does, kept catching a return signal in roughly the right place. That return showed something civilian radar never did. The plane had turned. Not drifted off course, turned sharply back across the Malay Peninsula, away from Beijing and toward the Andaman Sea. Whoever or whatever was flying that plane had turned it around and pointed it into some of the least monitored ocean on the planet. Military radar lost the signal for good a little after 2 in the morning, northwest of Penang. After that, there was nothing conventional left to track it with. Except there was one more thing. Even with its transponder off, the aircraft satellite communications unit kept automatically shaking hands with an Inmarsat satellite parked in geostationary orbit over the Indian Ocean. A routine maintenance ping that had nothing to do with tracking the plane's position, but which, as it turned out, was the only thread investigators had left to pull. 7 of these handshakes came in over the next 6 hours. Engineers used the tiny delays and frequency shifts in those signals to sketch out 2 enormous possible flight paths, one arcing north over Asia, one plunging south into open ocean. The northern route was quickly ruled out, a rogue 777 crossing that much monitored airspace would have been spotted somewhere. That left the southern arc, and a final handshake at 8:19 a.m. that marked, most likely, the moment the plane ran out of fuel. That line became known as the 7th Arc, and it defined the search zone for the next decade. Roughly 120,000 square kilometers of remote seafloor in the southern Indian Ocean, an area about the size of the state of Pennsylvania. Ships and aircraft, and eventually autonomous submarines spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars dragging sonar across that seabed. They found almost nothing. A handful of confirmed and suspected debris fragments eventually washed ashore. A flapper on Réunion Island, panel fragments in Mozambique, more pieces scattered across Madagascar, Tanzania, Mauritius, and South Africa. But no black box, no cockpit voice recorder, no main wreckage. The official search was suspended in January 2017 without an answer, and a second attempt by the marine robotics firm Ocean Infinity in 2018 also came up empty. For a mystery built almost entirely on math, that math had a serious credibility problem. If the Inmarsat calculations were as solid as investigators believed, why did they keep pointing rescuers to open water and nothing else? In the vacuum left by that failure, one explanation became the default answer in headlines and documentaries. that the captain, an experienced pilot with tens of thousands of flying hours, deliberately depressurized the cabin, incapacitated everyone on board, and flew the aircraft on a long, silent path south until it ran out of fuel and dropped into the sea, sometimes called a ghost flight scenario. It's a tidy story. It's also one that a closer look at the physical evidence makes hard to fully accept. Start with the satellite data itself. The final Inmarsat handshake, the one used to draw the seventh arc, carries a frequency signature that several analyses, including a 2016 review by Australia's Transport Safety Agency, interpreted as consistent with a steep, high-speed descent, potentially several thousand feet per minute faster than a controlled glide. That doesn't sound like a fuel exhaustion glide toward a calm ditching. It sounds like something closer to an uncontrolled dive. Then there's the debris. The flaperon recovered from Réunion Island in 2015 didn't show the kind of clean separation you'd expect from a deliberate, low-energy water landing. Its trailing edge had the kind of shredding associated with high-speed flutter damage, and the flap itself was retracted, meaning the aircraft was still in cruise configuration, not set up for a landing, when it broke apart. Other recovered fragments showed fracture patterns consistent with high-energy overload rather than a gentle impact. And then there's the search itself. Every dollar spent scouring that seabed rested on a chain of assumptions stacked on top of each other. That the satellite arcs were precise, that the fuel burn models were accurate, that the aircraft flew on autopilot in a straight line until the tanks ran dry. Years of finding nothing but ridgelines and undersea canyons made it hard to avoid the conclusion that at least one of those assumptions was wrong, and the search zone itself might be sitting in the wrong place. By the time the last hulls left the search area in 2017, families of the passengers had no wreckage, no black box, and no explanation they could fully trust. That frustration is exactly the gap Richard Godfrey walked into. Godfrey is a retired aerospace engineer who had spent decades around aviation systems before turning his attention, almost obsessively, to MH370. A couple of years after the official search folded, he became fixated on a question that sounds almost too strange to take seriously. Could you track a missing jumbo jet using a hobbyist radio network built to help amateur operators measure how far their signals travel? The system is called WSPR, Weak Signal Propagation Reporter, pronounced Whisper, and it was never designed with aviation in mind. Thousands of amateur radio operators around the world use it to send extremely low-power signals, often less than a single watt, that bounce off the ionosphere and can travel enormous distances. Every successful transmission gets logged automatically in a public database, creating what amounts to a constantly updating web of radio links stretched across the globe. Godfrey's idea was that a large aircraft crossing one of those links physically disturbs the signal, a barely perceptible dip in strength or a tiny shift in frequency, and that disturbance gets recorded right alongside everything else in that database. If MH370 crossed dozens of those invisible links on its way south, the theory goes, the fingerprints of that flight might still be sitting in years' worth of raw data, waiting to be pulled out. It took him roughly 3 years of digging through the archive, building his own filtering software to separate genuine aircraft disturbances from solar interference and background noise. Eventually, he says, he isolated around 130 anomalies over the Indian Ocean on the night of the disappearance that couldn't be explained by weather or normal propagation. Plotted in sequence, he argued, they traced a path that began near where Malaysian military radar last caught the plane, curved southwest, and then bent south, broadly consistent with what investigators had already suspected, but drawn with far more geographic precision than the Inmarsat arcs ever allowed. That path, in Godfrey's analysis, ended at a specific point in the southern Indian Ocean, roughly 1,500 kilometers west of Perth, inside a stretch of seabed that no earlier search, official or private, had actually covered. A single point on a map isn't proof. Godfrey knew that, and he took his data to Simon Maskell, a professor who leads a signal processing and Bayesian statistics research group at the University of Liverpool, the kind of team with experience applying probabilistic modeling to exactly this sort of maritime search problem. Maskell has been publicly candid that he finds the Whisper hypothesis plausible rather than proven, describing himself as leaning toward Godfrey's side of the argument while stressing that further validation is still needed. The collaboration ran the anomalies through several checks. One was straightforward. Did the timing of the radio disturbances line up with the known timeline of the Inmarsat handshakes? According to Godfrey's published analysis, they lined up closely, and no other known aircraft could account for the same pattern of disturbances in that airspace that night. A second check dealt with geometry. Because each whisper link runs along a specific line between two named radio stations, overlapping disturbances from different links can, in principle, be triangulated into a narrower corridor than the broad, hundreds of kilometers wide Inmarsat arcs ever allowed. A third check tried to rule out the possibility that the disturbances were simply normal ionospheric noise by filtering for strong, high-confidence signal drops in a specific frequency band associated with large aircraft crossings. Godfrey and his collaborators later went a step further, chartering a Boeing 777 to fly a test route over open ocean while whisper stations logged data in real time, reporting that disturbances appeared where and when the aircraft actually crossed monitored links, evidence, in their view, that the underlying physical effect is real, whatever the ultimate limits of using it to relocate a 12-year-old crash site. None of that has settled the argument. The technology's own inventor, Nobel laureate Joe Taylor, has acknowledged that aircraft can disturb whisper signals in principle, but has been notably more cautious than Godfrey about whether the current data can support pinpointing an exact location. Other independent investigators and aviation journalists who have followed the case for years have gone considerably further, dismissing the whisper-based crash site claims as statistically unconvincing, arguing that a real Boeing 777 could not plausibly have flown the kind of winding, back-and-forth path Godfrey's early plot suggested, and that treating faint, noisy propagation data as a precision tracking tool overstates what the underlying physics can actually deliver. It's also true that Godfrey's proposed coordinates have shifted more than once over the years as his analysis evolved, which critics point to as evidence of a moving target, even as Godfrey and his supporters frame it as normal scientific refinement. Separately, oceanographers running ocean drift simulations, modeling how debris confirmed to be from MH370 could have traveled from a crash site to where it eventually washed ashore in places like Réunion, Mozambique, and Madagascar, have produced probable origin zones in the southern Indian Ocean that overlap, at least loosely, with the broader region Godfrey has pointed to. Though this kind of drift modeling carries its own wide margins of error and is not by itself a confirmation of any single coordinate, whatever the scientific disagreements, Godfrey's work did something few independent theories about MH370 ever managed. It moved a government to act. In early 2025, Malaysia's Transport Ministry signed a new no-find, no-fee contract with Ocean Infinity to search a roughly 15,000 square kilometer zone of the southern Indian Ocean, informed in part by the whisper-based analysis, with Malaysia committing to pay around $70 million only if the wreckage was actually located. Ocean Infinity deployed its Armada-class vessels, equipped with Hugin autonomous underwater drones capable of diving thousands of meters and scanning the seafloor in far greater detail than the equipment used during the original 2014 to 2017 search. The mission ran in fits and starts. A first phase in March 2025 was cut short by seasonal weather. A second phase resumed at the very end of December 2025 and continued into January 2026, with Ocean Infinity's crews covering thousands of additional square kilometers of previously unsearched seabed. Here's where the story, as of the middle of 2026, does not have the ending a lot of hopeful headlines promised. On January 23, 2026, Ocean Infinity withdrew from the search area. On March 8, 2026, the 12th anniversary of the disappearance, the company confirmed publicly that this latest phase of the search had ended without finding any trace of the aircraft, despite mapping well over 140,000 square kilometers of seafloor across all its missions since 2018. Ocean Infinity's chief executive said the team had used every piece of data and technology available to them, and that even with search precision far beyond what existed in 2018, the wreckage still hadn't turned up. That has not ended the effort. In June 2026, Malaysia's cabinet approved a one-year extension of the Ocean Infinity contract, pushing the no-find, no-fee agreement out to June 2027, specifically so the company can return during the commerce sailing season, expected between November and April, to finish covering the roughly 7,400 square kilometers of the agreed search box that remain unsurveyed. Families of the passengers, represented by groups like Voice 370, have publicly pushed for exactly this kind of extension, while acknowledging that a resumed search is unlikely before conditions improve later in the year. So, as of now, Richard Godfrey has not been proven right, and he has not been proven wrong. His whisper technique persuaded a national government to fund an expensive, targeted search of a specific patch of ocean that no one had checked before, which is a real, measurable outcome few independent MH370 theories have achieved. It has not yet produced a black box, a wing, or a fuselage. Respected researchers remain split, with some cautiously sympathetic to the underlying physics and others openly skeptical that faint radio noise can be turned into precise coordinates over a crash site more than a decade old. What is certain is that the search isn't over. Ocean Infinity says its commitment to the case hasn't ended just because this phase has. Malaysia has now bet on this search continuing into 2027, and families who have waited more than 12 years for an answer are, once again, waiting for a weather window, a functioning fleet of underwater drones, and one more pass over a stretch of ocean that has kept its secret longer than almost any other in modern history. Whether Richard Godfrey's radio whisper theory turns out to be the breakthrough that finally closes the book on MH370, or one more confident-sounding dead end in a mystery full of them, is still an open question. But for the first time in years, someone managed to turn a hobbyist's idea into an actual ship on an actual ocean, looking in an actual place nobody had looked before. That, on its own, is more than most theories about MH370 ever get. Thanks for watching. If this kept you hooked, let us know what you think really happened to MH370 down in the comments, and stick around. There's more of this rabbit hole waiting for you next.